Hello gamers, Powered Heal here, and welcome to the first episode of a new segment we're going to be doing on the channel, where we look at thoughts and ideas of things that we want to see in the new WoW Classic Plus. So for the first episode, we're going to be looking at loot and loot systems. I think this is a great time to do that because lots of people are thinking about loot with the Burning Crusade anniversary on the horizon. People want to know, are we, getting GDKP back? Are we going to be stuck with hard reserve and soft reserve? I think the reality is that Blizzard can just do a lot better for us in terms of loot than just, talking about and discussing these systems. And if they just put a little bit of effort, they can make something that's really special going forward into the next iteration of Classic, whatever that may be. So hopefully, people see this video, and if you enjoy this, you like what I'm saying, then proliferate it as much as possible, and maybe we can get some change coming in. So, in order to start this video, I want to talk a little bit about the history of loot and kind of Blizzard's reluctance to meddle in it. And ultimately, I think a lot of people think this is a good thing. So, ever since the game kind of started, we've had this very, very basic UI where you kind of, you have a need before greed system. I think that was even added later. I think initially it was like only master looting for certain things. But the idea would be, you have the role system, very, very basic. And then if you want, you can turn on to master loot. And at that point, Blizzard's kind of giving the keys to you and telling you figure out a way to dole out these items amongst your raid. I think that makes a lot of sense because the first thought is pretty intuitive. It's like, why would you want Big Brother kind of like watching over you and deciding who gets loot in your guild or anything like that? And it's actually a little bit funny because if you guys are only Classic players, you probably weren't around for a time where Blizzard actually did something like this. And it turned out to be kind of I would say a huge disaster that was universally reviled, right? So sometimes you try things, they don't work out. But basically what happened is in the current retail line, like a while back, they did something. I remember doing it, that it was a thing in Dazara lore in Battle for Azeroth. I'm not sure how long it lasted, but there was a thing called personal loot. And what personal loot was is, how you go into Molten Core and you kill like Lucifron. Let's say he drops 4 items and they're spread out amongst your raid. So if Classic WoW had personal loot, what would happen is instead of Lucifron actually dropping the items, the 4 items that Lucifron dropped would be kind of randomly spread out throughout the raid, but they would be class appropriate. So it would basically roll who got the item. So let's say it rolled like a paladin in your raid, then it would roll an item that might be like, suitable for that paladin. So it's not like, you're giving Bone Reaver's Edge to a mage or something like that. It wasn't like that terrible. But the idea was that it would pick people in your raid that would be seeded for loot, and then those players would basically get loot from that boss. Then another boss, other players might get loot and things of that nature. And this was basically done because for a while there was some pushback on the normal loot system because people, they felt like it was really hard to have a fair loot system essentially. And the direction that Blizzard ultimately ended up going was they tried this personal loot system, and then I feel like they just sort of added more loot to the game and more ways to get loot, and that was kind of their solution of dealing with the problem. So, there was a little bit of loot scarcity. Obviously, it wasn't as much as it was back in the day with original WoW Classic, and they were like, yeah, let's just kind of kill the scarcity, and they did that, and then I think that kind of quelled a lot of people's concerns about loot in general. And, that's one way to solve the problem, right? But I don't think the players that are going to be playing Classic Plus necessarily want that type of solution, right? We could do something a bit more involved. And basically my idea is that Blizzard should really support a lot of these systems that we see that exist outside the game, inside of the game. And it's a very similar effort to kind of what they're doing right now with WoW Midnight for retail, where the idea is they're trying to take all these add-ons that exist and they're trying to make them native to the game so that a player doesn't have to go out and download a program from a third party in order to effectively play the game. And I think that's just a great thing. Now there's a little bit of issues that we're seeing right now in Midnight from the beta where some of the add-ons and things like that aren't up to stuff, but obviously it's kind of like a work in progress. It's not going to be there immediately. So the idea is that over time we'll have these add-ons built into the actual game itself. And I think that although this is more of a topic for another video, this is something we'll likely see in Classic and Classic Plus as well. But my thought is, why stop at add-ons? Why not go into loot systems? And the one that really comes to mind is actually kind of like the long-lost brother, I would say, of GDKP, the one that everybody's forgotten about, which is DKP, which is kind of where the name GDKP comes off of. So instead of gold DKP, it's just DKP. And for you guys that are uninitiated, this is a pretty old term. So what DKP stands for originally was Dragon Kill Points. I'm not exactly sure where it originated. I heard it was EverQuest, but it was kind of already a thing going into raiding way back in 2004 in Classic WoW. And the idea is basically that you get points for, attending, participating in raids, and then you get to spend those points, sometimes for out-of-raid activities as well. And then you get to spend those points on items in raid. Now, sometimes this comes with the cost of like a flat cost of an item. So you could have a system where, let's say Lawbringer shoulders cost 20 DKP, and anybody who wants those, when they drop, they put like a 1 in chat or something to signify that they're willing to spend their DKP, and then all the people who want those shoulders will roll, and then the person who wins has the DKP subtracted. It could go like that. It could be a bidding system where people are openly bidding each other, kind of like GDKP. Everything's out in the open. It could be a silent bidding system where you all send the amount of DKP that you were planning on spending on the item to somebody's whispers, and then that gets subtracted from your DKP total if you win. So there's a bunch of ways you could handle this system-wise. But the thing is you're already probably realizing it's a lot of logistics. And not only is it a lot of logistics, but it requires a lot of trust, right? So especially with something where the bidding is not transparent, where you have private bidding, now you're really relying on your guild master, your loot master, whoever it wants to be, to basically provide a fair environment for everybody participating, right? And there's ways, obviously, you can kind of put checks and balances in here, but for the most part, it does involve a lot of trust, and it's really annoying for the people who run the system. And I've run DKP systems in the past, and it's just a lot to keep track of. And we have better tools, honestly, than we kind of ever did before. It's really easy to make things on websites or spreadsheets and things of that nature. But still, it's a lot to maintain. There's kind of a lot of responsibility there, right? Because the idea is if you mess something up, you put something wrong into the system, you're affecting tons of players in your guild, everybody gets mad. So I'm thinking, why doesn't Blizzard just put in a system where you could have a version of GDKP within the game, and then you can kind of set it up how you want? So the idea would be, they have the basic structure of a GDKP system, and you can decide certain things, like do you want it to be private bid? Do you want it to be public bid? Do you want there to be decay? What do you want the decay rate? Do you want new players getting a bonus? And you can pick all these things. You can kind of like award points to people based on activity. And you create a whole in-game interface / system where you could do this loot system. And it wouldn't have to stop at, DKP. You could do other things as well. One of the common loot systems I wouldn't say common, but I think one of the best loot systems, which I might make a video on actually in 2019 Classic WoW, was Loot List. And I think this was great because it was kind of a compromise of simplicity on the organizer's behalf, as well as kind of fairness on the people who participate in the system. And what Loot List was basically was that, you had a list of things, and you would put the thing that you wanted most highest on the list, and you would rank them like 1 to however many things. And you basically would get those items in that order. But if somebody else put those items, in the same order, so if somebody else had the same item at the same spot you did, you would have to roll against that person. And then also these values would be kind of augmented by things like attendance and things of that nature. And, so you would basically have like a formula that was like, you take the person's spot on the loot list, and then you would check it against attendance and things of that nature in a spreadsheet. And then you would get like a final point value that, so this person is like, 65 on Onslaught Girdle. And maybe there's 3 other people that are 65 because they all put it first and they all have perfect attendance. And then to be like a tier down from that and a tier down from that. And you could kind of do all these things with, an in-game system. And it would be obviously even easier. It'd be a little bit annoying for them to develop, but once they did, it would be amazing, you know what I mean? Because now, all of a sudden, like, the logistical aspect that was kind of oppressing so many people just kind of goes away. And a great example of this, I think, was it was actually this time around in my Paladins guild on Alliance side, where we kind of just had a slash roll system in this guild, and this is kind of the reason why I left the guild. I was like, I don't want to be in a guild where we're just slash rolling guys. Like, the people are cool, and I get it, but that's like a little too loose for me, And there were kind of suggestions in this open suggestion forum and how to change it. And this guy made this long, intricate post that he was basically kind of arguing for a DKP system, but I don't think he was familiar with what DKP was. So it didn't really come off exactly like that, but he was like, yeah, we can have all these incentives for people and things of that nature. And the lead officer was just like, that sounds great and I would love to do it, but I just can't be bothered. And that's just the reality, it's the truth. People play the game to have fun, and a lot of the people who are organizing guilds and things of that nature, they're already doing a lot of logistics, just setting up the runs themselves, right? Making sure things go well strategy-wise, as well as having people in certain runs, especially for guilds doing split runs and things of that nature, or just you have a big guild with multiple runs. So then to add this loot system where you now need to integrate all these people in, from all these different runs, it's just an absolute nightmare. So I think if Blizzard could add something to the game where, we could set up these types of things, it would be really cool. Obviously, in the case of Loot List, it's a little bit different. You would need something like a dungeon journal in the game so you kind of see all the items beforehand. And that way people could be allowed to make their lists. Or I guess when you make the list in the interface, you would see all the items there. So there's a lot of things we could do. And you could come up with, there's tons of loot systems they could implement. But I think that you wouldn't want to set it off as this super ambitious thing where they have to include every last loot system. But I think that the most obvious one is DKP, because it's by far the most flexible. And, I think it kind of controls for the most amount of problems in the game. And if they gave enough parameters, you could set up a really fair DKP system, honestly. And I think the only reason why this doesn't happen nowadays is really just because, like I said, the logistics are just far too much for your average person, and people just aren't as into doing things as they were way back in the day, because keep in mind, this is kind of like the only thing to do back in the day. Like, if you wanted to play hardcore kind of like MMOs back in the day and invest a lot of time into it, WoW Classic was a huge thing back in 2004. Everybody was just willing to give a lot more of their time and effort to the game, and that's just not quite as much of a thing anymore. That's okay, but hopefully, if Blizzard's out there listening, this is something that could be on the radar, because even just having something like a GDKP system added into the game that guilds could use and mess around with, oh man, I think it would make so many players so happy, because the main thing that people just don't really like about Loot Council, I think, is the lack of autonomy. It's not necessarily that we all think that every Loot Council is corrupt, every Loot Council is unfair, but you kind of just want to say in what items you get, and you want to be able to kind of use strategy maybe and think about what item is really a great upgrade for you and what's more of a side grade and things of that nature. And having a system like DKP where you can bid a certain amount of points on certain items based on what you think they're worth, it's kind of like the ultimate loot system, right? It takes the good part about GDKP, which is the autonomy, and being able to kind of, focus on certain things that you really want and then not care as much about things that you don't want. So it takes that, and it basically leaves us without the, the problem of all this, of circulating around all this bought gold and things of that nature. So I think it's a really cool thing if they would allow this, but we'll have to see going forward. If you like this, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, share the video so hopefully Blizzard sees it. Maybe we get some eyes and attention on this going to Classic Plus, and I will talk to you guys next time.